And amazing. With that, let's jump right into it. So, and for those of you who haven't muted your microphones, if you could do that at this point, that would be great. But Vinod, you started working at Sun Microsystems with your classmates at Stanford in the 1980s, and a lot has changed since then in both the computer science realm and entrepreneurship. But what sorts of lessons did you learn that entrepreneurs still need to be hearing to this day?
Yeah. So a few very important lessons. So a little bit of history that's not very well known. Andy Bechtolsheim was a graduate student trying to finish his PhD at Stanford. And he had developed this technology, intellectual property. He had licensed it to 6 other firms that wanted to commercialize it. And in fact, one of those firms was actually funded by Kleiner Perkins, the firm that funded us eventually. But none of them succeeded except for some. There were, I think at the end of our first year, which was 1982, I counted probably 25 startups with roughly the same spec. Unix, 68,000 processor, multi-bus, megapixel graphic display, I can go on. So why did Sun succeed and the others did not? Fundamentally, instead of licensing the technology, I spent all my time convincing Andy Bechtolsheim initially, and then Bill Joy after that, to put their PhDs on hold and join me. So I focus not on the technology, but on the team. And I think that's the principal reason that Sun outdid the 30 other people that were doing the same spec. 6 of them licensed from Andy Bechtolsheim, so exactly the same technology. But we built the team. They tried to just take advantage of the technology. And I think that was the principal difference. What happened as a result is the first 15 or 20 people we hired were all people who wanted to work with Andy Bechtolsheim and Bill Joy and people like that. Nobody cared about me. And so we got Eric Schmidt to come work for us. He was my VP of engineering sometime in 1982. Why did he join? Because we had a great sounding team, not because he could have joined any of the 30 other companies. And because of the team we assembled, I could give you a dozen examples. But I believe the first 15 or 20 people at Sun created more billion-dollar companies than almost any other startup I know out of their first 15 or 20 people. Much, much later, we saw PayPal follows the same model. They assembled an awesome team, and then awesome companies came out of the initial PayPal team. So it's more about the team you assemble than what you're really trying to do, because what you're trying to do keeps changing every 3 months. And so I like to say the difference between a $0 million revenue company and a $0 billion revenue company, though they're mathematically equivalent, is the attitude you take, the ambitions you set for yourself, and the team you decide to build to go after that ambition.
Yeah, that's absolutely great to hear. And I think, in our audience today, we have a lot of early stage entrepreneurs who are with their team members here listening to your advice. So what is the biggest advice that you would have for those early stage entrepreneurs? And what specifically do you look for at Khosla Ventures when you want to make your investments?
Well, the first thing you look for is the team exceptional. And when it isn't, and a lot of founding teams aren't, the second most important thing I look for is how are they thinking about who else they need to hire in the next year or two. And if that's ambitious, then then I think they'll assemble a good team. Now, one clear indication of that is how large an option pool they set aside for future recruiting. It tells me what kind of mindset they have to building a great team. The second thing is you can be more or less ambitious. And this is a very, very important point, in my view. No company got to Mount Everest, if you think of that as the ambitious goal, in one step. But you want to pick an area that leads to Everest, not to a peak at 15,000 feet, if you know the Mount Everest analogy. But you have to get there through a base camp. So you don't go after, there's not a straight path to Mount Everest. So you have to be thoughtful about where's base camp, where's camp 1, camp 2, camp 3, camp 4, so on, before the final ascent to this really big company. It's very important people think that way. And one mistake is people don't think through all the steps to getting to the big goal. On the inverse side, they don't set a big goal, so they just think of the first step. But when you just think about the first step, you might find a local maximum. You might find a higher revenue business, but that won't lead to the big ambition. And that's pretty common. So people, by licensing or corporate partnering, will often take a great opportunity, turn it into a decent or small opportunity with lower risk. So I would summarize it as you can increase the probability of success and reduce the consequences of success, make them inconsequential. I like to see more ambitious goals where the probability of failure may be higher, the probability of success lower, but the consequences of success are much more consequential. I would say that's not the only correct strategy. This is where every entrepreneur has to gaze at his or her navel and say, what do I really enjoy? So you have to know your goals. If you're trying to build another Google or Facebook, then you'd better think about all the steps to the large path. If you're trying to do something where, and this is perfectly legitimate, I just want to be my own boss. I don't want to work for anybody. That's a perfectly legitimate goal, but then you don't have to shoot for Mount Everest. Or say, I just want to make a ton of money. That's a perfectly legitimate goal. Or I just want to work with a few friends. All these are legitimate goals. I just think entrepreneurs should be aware of which is their real goal and how they will make trade-offs.
Yeah, that's definitely really great advice, especially from the lens on the flip side as an investor. So I wanted to segue into more of your vision and thesis for Khosla Ventures, which revolves around reinventing societal infrastructure. You talk about this idea of how you look for moonshot thinking and taking the impossible to possible in a way that will push technological innovation. Can you elaborate on that a little bit about what you mean by reinventing societal infrastructure, and how do you see this create opportunities as a venture investor?
So the first thing I'd say, that isn't the only way to do a startup. So there may be other ways your audience's members are thinking about that are perfectly legitimate. What I like isn't necessarily the only way or even right for everybody, because they may have different personal goals, different ambitions. You may want to solve a very narrow problem because it's affected you or your family in some way. Those are all really good goals. Having said that, I asked myself the following question. And I did that after I turned 60. and said, what do I want to work on for 25 years? I'm now 66. I still think I'm working another 25 years, health permitting. And hopefully in 10 years, I want to work another 35 years because anti-aging technologies moved along. But I asked myself the question, what would be meaningful for me to work on? And I'm a total optimist, so almost an impractical optimist. And I looked at where I could make the most difference. And I realized, having grown up in India, that about 700 million people on the planet have a rich lifestyle. And by rich, I mean rich in resources, rich in the transportation, the cars they have, rich in the house they have, the housing, rich in the education they have or access to, rich in medical care, rich in entertainment. In every way, about 700 million people have it. All 7 billion people on the planet want it. And if we did what we've done in the past, one can never achieve that 7 billion without destroying the planet. 10 times more steel, 10 times more mining, 10 times more cement, 10 times more cars, it just doesn't work. 10 times more doctors is near impossible, especially in countries like India or Tanzania. So I asked myself the question, is hundreds of percent reduction in resource needs while shooting for the same rich lifestyle for all 7 billion people, is it possible, or which parts of the global GDP is it possible in? And I was shocked to discover, even sitting by myself writing away, I could come up with reinventing most parts of non-governmental GDP. Governmental GDP is a whole different thing, with that kind of multiplier on resources, which is very, very encouraging, which is really the opportunity for all of you. You can, in fact, reinvent societal infrastructure to be much more efficient and not need more resources from the planet, but we don't have to compromise on the standard of living afforded to the bottom 10% of the planet's population. So that's what I call societal reinvention. We can go into any area and dig deep and say, how's that even possible? Now, most experts don't believe this is possible, but I say they don't because they're experts. And experts like to extrapolate the past. They don't like to invent the future. They can't possibly invent the future you want to invent as an entrepreneur. So let me give you one word of caution, because most of you will talk to experts if you're trying to be an entrepreneur. There is no example I could think of, not one, and hopefully there may be some that I don't know of. In the last 40 years, their larger innovation came from somebody who was an expert in an area. You know, there's no chance anybody at Boeing or Lockheed could invent SpaceX or Rocket Lab. They just would think it's a multi-billion-dollar program. There's no chance anybody at Walmart or Target could have done what Amazon did to retailer. There's no hotel chain, Hilton or Hyatt, that would have done Airbnb. No rental company like Hertz or Avis could have invented Uber. I can go on. In fact, no large pharmaceutical company was involved in biotechnology early. They didn't even think it was possible. So there are no examples of large innovation coming from a large entity, whether it's a for-profit institution or a non-profit institution, there's no way Siemens or GE can do anything relevant to climate change. Zero chance. They can scale something once others have done. You know, Volkswagen and GM will do a great job of scaling electric cars, but they couldn't have done what Tesla did, which is establish the category. You'd think it's the most likely category in which the incumbents would have an advantage. When you analyze the problem 10, 15 years ago, you'd say, no chance a startup can do this. But Tesla did that. Waymo or Google really started the whole trend to driverless cars. QuantumScape did batteries, electric batteries. There's no large company that's taken a large leap in batteries. All of them are incremental. So large institutions, the Department of Energy, people like that are great at extrapolating the past, but not at inventing the future we want. Why? Because their experience is a bias that reverts their organizations to minor extrapolations of the past. Intel can go from 16 nanometer semiconductors to 7 nanometer semiconductors. It's a relatively defined path. But they can't invent a new base material for semiconductors. You know, it's exciting when you can think of reinventing the future the way you want it. Anyway, let me stop there.
Yeah, that's definitely so true. I feel like I did not think about that trend before.
You know, there's a few areas where deep science matters. Moderna is an example, but Moderna is a startup. Hello? Yeah.
Yeah, I think Natasha unfortunately got cut out. Her audio is not coming through. But the next point that we kind of wanted to touch on was how do you think this rate of reinvention over time has adjusted, whether it's slowed down, stayed the same, or sped up? And what specifically are the tools behind this that are changing this process over time and its rate?
Yeah. So if you look 10 or 15 years ago, venture capital and technology investing was mostly about the technology areas, whether it was mobile, internet, enterprise, consumer services like Facebook. So technology mostly changed technology businesses. What has changed dramatically is every part of global GDP is going huge technology-driven changes and economic disruption. Nobody would have imagined 10 years ago when we first invested in Impossible Foods that you could change the lowly hamburger. Literally, people said impossible. And that's why the name Impossible came. They didn't think plant proteins would be a viable source of protein other than for vegetarians. In fact, the goal at Impossible was ambitious. We don't want any vegetarian to eat this. It has to taste so much like meat, they cannot eat this and won't like this taste, was the goal. So we were anti-vegetarian, trying to get everybody onto this platform that was consuming meat for one very simple reason. Somewhere between 30 to 50% of the planet's land area is used for animal husbandry, and you couldn't address climate change without addressing this large source of emissions in meat production. And meat production was one of the fastest growing food categories because of economic growth in India and China and other parts of the world. So that was the ambition. And now plant proteins and food innovation is a category that didn't exist in venture capital 10 years ago. 10 years ago, people didn't take a new form of transportation like Uber seriously. It was this fringe version of limousines that only a few could afford. The same is true of Airbnbs. It was these weirdos who'd stay in somebody else's house in a spare bedroom. That was the niche. Now they probably have more rooms than Hilton under their management. So my point is there's no area, whether it's hotels or limousines or car rentals or food, that's open. Let me give you other examples. Right out of the MIT Plasma Fusion Lab, we started a fusion reactor company, Commonwealth Fusion Systems. And it took me 18 months to work with them before we could actually incubate the idea. It was complex, took a lot of work. People would say fusion isn't a startup thing, and it's a 50-year project. And our hope is we'll disprove those assumptions. One of my most exciting ideas is, can we 3D print whole multi-story buildings? And we are well on our way. I think this will be a solved problem in 3 years. That most multifamily housing of 3 to 5 stories will be 3D printed with less than half the carbon footprint and less than half the cost, because low carbon technologies have to be accessible or very low cost. So those are examples. I would generally say there's no area that's not open to innovation. And when somebody tells me it's not open to innovation, I think it's a limitation in their imagination, not what the facts are. I like to tell people most people are limited not by what they can do, but what they think they can do. So we've just funded a public transit company, and people say, public transit in a startup? Those are 30-year projects. Imagine the Boston Tunnel dig. This is crazy stuff, but no, it's entirely possible.
Yeah, that's so true. Sorry, my audio cut out earlier. So now I just want to dive deeper into how this applies into some specific industries. You've expressed your interest into clean tech, but also how you value short innovation cycles when you evaluate promising startups. And I guess many people argue that the expenses as well as time to create these lasting and noticeable impacts with these like clean tech startups are quite enormous. I think there's a statistic of around $73 trillion to stop global warming. So what are your thoughts on investing in clean tech, and where do you see the future of these energy efficient systems?
Yeah, so let me fundamentally say there's people who do things and people who pontificate. There's pontificators who cite numbers like $93 trillion because they've never done shit in their life. Literally, honestly, they irritate the hell out of me because they make the problem so much more complex than it needs to be. That's not to say some of these problems aren't really, really hard and won't take a while. The QuantumScape battery took 10 years. I think we are very much at the cusp of sustainable aviation fuels to reduce carbon emission from aviation. I think in this decade, that will be considered a solved problem without going to hydrogen-based aviation or something so fundamentally different. So there's these pontificators who basically are naysayers. And to them, I say skeptics never did the impossible. They will tell you why things can't be done. They won't do anything, and they won't tell you how to do anything. And so at the other end, there's like pie in the sky people who imagine things that where the path dependence is too hard. So it's only a matter of how much risk you're taking when you embark on a path. If there's more obstacles, your probability of failure goes up. That's not to say it shouldn't be attempted, but let me take an example specifically like fusion. Everybody said 50-year project. ITER is already a $20 billion 50-year project. Hopefully with fusion power in the second half of this century, sometime. Well, we decided to say, how can you change the trajectory of fusion? And the answer was the size of a reactor and hence its cost changes as to the fourth power of T, or Tesla magnets. So if you got magnets that were 4 times more powerful, you'd literally reduce the size by 250 times roughly for the plasma reactor. It also happens, there was innovation going on in room temperature semiconductors. So 20 Tesla magnets didn't feel that hot. And instead of saying, what's the 50-year path? We said, let's try it with one very simple idea. If we built a 20 Tesla magnet, and we can't get to fusion, there's lots of medical uses for a 20 Tesla medicine. All of nuclear medicine would love it. So it's not like it'd be a wasted effort. So we planned in 3 years to get to 20 Tesla magnet. And we think we are very much on track to do that. But it's finding entrepreneurial ways to get funding because there was a backup strategy, that kind of thing. So entrepreneurs always invent their way around it. Now, pontificators look at big numbers like 93 trillion, but they fundamentally don't understand the nature of exponentials. All of you have heard the story of a grain of rice on a chessboard, and you put 2 in the next and 4 in the next, and it doubles. Very soon, you get to more rice than has ever been produced in the history of the planet. That is the way to solve these very large number problems. And we are seeing this in electric cars. My funnest statistic is around 2010, 2011, the Department of Energy, talking to all those experts at General Motors and Ford and Volkswagen and others, projected a number of electric cars in 25 years from then, which is 2035 forecast. Their 2035 forecast for the number of electric cars, based on all the expertise on the planet, was exceeded by Tesla by 2015 or 2016. Think about it. Because Elon Musk didn't care about the top-down numbers, he said, why don't I create a great product, and then I'll move it down in price point, and it'll keep growing exponentially. And I think the rice story will play out in electric cars. And in 15 years, internal combustion engine-based cars will be a very niche market and largely irrelevant. In fact, many major manufacturers like Volvo and Volkswagen and others have announced they're no longer building new internal combustion engines. So I would say, believe in the power of exponential growth. If you create a great product and can find ways for it to grow exponentially, then just do the math and don't worry about the experts. Experts have very linear thinking and they love extrapolating the past.
Yeah, I feel we hear so much negativity around this issue, so it's inspiring to hear your optimism. Another point I want to touch on is that Khosla Ventures invests a lot into healthcare and health tech related companies like AliveCore, for example. And you've even been on the record to say that a doctor's job should be reduced to 20% and 80% should be doctor algorithm. Do you think we are reaching that goal with AI technologies and these automated medical diagnostic tools that have emerged? And how do you see the healthcare innovation evolve in the next decade or so?
Well, so about 6-7 years ago, I wrote a 100-page document, which in PDF form, it's a little more than 100 pages, on how to transform medicine with dramatic reductions in cost and dramatic increase in quality. And the only way to do it is mostly remove the human element in it, in decision-making, but to leave the human element in the human element of care. So the interface to a patient, a human may still be the right person to communicate and talk to. But everything else and 24/7 service should be done by AI. And looking at something I forecast 6 or 7 years ago, and I haven't had the patience to go back and read it, but it's called 20% Doctor Included. If you Google that, my name, it will come up. I'm very sure, and in it, I defined a 25-year kind of journey, that we are well on track for that journey. And for 6 or 7 years old forecast, it's surprisingly accurate today. But, that's top down. One of my key speculations was that data science will do more for medicine than all the biological sciences. That's very contrarian. I'm 100% convinced of that. In delivering medicine, I'm not talking about research. I'm 100% convinced, and it's 5 years ago when I told med school students at Stanford, if they wanted to be great doctors, go to the math department, not the med department. People said I was bonkers. But I think we are on that path. And frankly, my son started a company called Curai to provide free primary care to 7 billion people on the planet as a 10-year goal. I think that's very, very likely to happen. And he was a Stanford graduate about 3 years ago. I think it's pretty certain for me, barring regulatory delays, which are artificial delays, usually pushed by the American Medical Association. They won't even let a nurse prescribe an antibiotic in most states in the country. So there are obstacles to adoption of the right technologies, but there's no question that'll happen. There's no question. An oncologist shouldn't, if you suddenly develop breast cancer, be required to remember the last 5,000 papers on every genetic mutation in breast cancer. It should be an AI system that has the expertise, and maybe the oncologist's job is to deliver the news in the right way. But I'm convinced of that. But that's not just true to physicians and delivery of physician expertise. It's also true of drug discovery. There's no chance, in my view, that 10 years from now, drug discovery will be done the way it's done today. It will be AI driven. It will take expertise very, very different than today's. And though initially a clinical trial, which is an expensive part of drug discovery, will still look like it is, even that, I think, over time will change because we can do fine-grained measurement of things. If you look at all the anti-aging startups, it's hard to ever go through a traditional clinical trial because to start with, the FDA doesn't even classify aging as a disease. So how do you do a trial and how do you measure clinical results over 20 or 30 years? But there's clever entrepreneurs have found ways around it. They can build machine learning systems for your skin, for example, and measure aging in a quantitative model. And then you can see fine-grained progress and not within weeks and days, instead of decades. So entrepreneurs always find a way.
Amazing. And so before we move on to the open forum from the audience, I'd love to learn a little bit more about how you have kind of soaked in VC and startup education over the years. We've even seen that even in the past few years, the modes of education distribution have evolved from books to personal blogs to Twitter, and now even more recently, Clubhouse. But what readings or books or education do you find yourself returning to that you think we should all know about?
Well, the most important thing is role models. proving things can be done that seemed impossible. So a good book I recommend to everybody is Loonshots. You know, it's a very fun book to read, but it's mostly about people who did the impossible. And I like to say, so that'd be among my favorite books. There's way too many books to recommend. You know, there's inspirational books like Loonshots, and then there's tactical books like Reid Hoffman's Blitzscaling. So depends on what you're looking for. There's probably a book for that. But there's a lot of information out there. There's a lot of blogs. It's the best way to learn.
Amazing. And now we'd love to open it up to the general audience. So if you have a question, please feel free to raise your virtual hand and then we'll call on you. You can also send questions through the chat and then, or personal DM Natasha and I, and we can also ask them. But let's start with Jason.
Hi, Vinod. Thank you so much for speaking with us. So I had a really big question. I've been thinking about this for a while, and I would love to hear your insight on it. What do you think the future is of the internet? Because I know based on your experience, you were very sort of, I guess, big in the bringing of computers and the internet. And so we've seen all these kind of like giant tech companies, and some people say they're like these oligopolies or even monopolies in some sense. Is it possible for another big tech company to emerge, or will the next company you think that's at their scale be in like a different field, almost like? Well, or do you think it'll still be like?
Would you have asked me this question just a few years ago before TikTok happened? You wouldn't
probably
have.
Yeah, you're right.
Right.
Okay.
TikTok happened. So competition doesn't come directly. It comes in orthogonal directions that are unanticipated. And, you know, take all the big tech startups. Every problem you hear about in the press, and there's a lot of legitimate problems, I look at as an opportunity for an entrepreneur. So if privacy is a big issue that most advertising models are violating, what would you do if you wanted to ensure privacy? What would be that startup? It feels to me very likely 5 years from now, we won't be talking about can TikTok emerge. We'll be talking about is a privacy-oriented startup possible? And we'll have examples of that. In fact, I'm working on that right now to sort of say, what would you do if you wanted to start with privacy? So turn a large problem into a large opportunity.
Okay, so, but in other words, I guess innovation will still happen in the software realm. It's not just perhaps hardware now or like some new medium like VR.
Absolutely. You know, just because you can't think of how it might happen doesn't mean it won't happen. Let me put it the following way that I fundamentally believe. Improbable doesn't mean it's not important. I would argue the only thing that's important is improbables. The problem with improbables is we don't know which improbable is going to end up being important 10 years from now. So that's sort of encouraging to all of you, hopefully. And frankly, an entrepreneur's job becomes taking something that everybody says is impossible, turn it into possible, then into probable, then make it happen. Like that's your job. Transition from impossible to possible but not likely to plausible to probable to actually happening. That's what every entrepreneur does.
Perfect. Thank you. And I sent you an email yesterday, but no worries if you don't respond.
Amazing. Thanks. Sophie, go ahead with your question.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Vinod. So I'm a doctor by training in cardiac surgery, and I'm currently completing my MBA at MIT Sloan. So in light of all your predictions about where healthcare is going, I'd love to know where you feel physicians like me, who are excited to be part of the transformation of healthcare into what you kind of outlined in some of your predictions, where we should plug in. So I've been looking at VC, but I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on where you think doctors can make the highest impact with their background and training.
Yeah. So in general, my general piece of advice to everybody, and I'll come back to doctors, is get diversity in your background, right? That means learn the ability to move from sector to sector by having a solid foundation. So any new sector you can relearn in 3 years. And frankly, every 5 years in my life, I've changed fields. What people think I'm doing, in the year 2000, people thought I only invested in telecom. And then people thought I only invested in climate. And then people thought I only invested in deep tech. And then healthcare. It's just, you can re-educate yourself. So my most important piece of advice is be very broad. If you're doing computer science, you might as well also do neuroscience. Like, don't try and go deeper in computer science, just add breadth. And there's a good book called Range on why breadth matters more than depth. In graduate school, going more depth makes a lot of sense. My general advice, first, it will be valuable to know how medicine is practiced today. If you're learning how to interpret a cardiac image, that's dead in the water, probably in the next 5 years, right? But if you're developing algorithms to do a CMRI, one of our companies has now reduced the time to do CMRI from an hour and 15 minutes to 15 minutes. So it becomes why? Because usually if you watch a cardiac MRI exam being done, there's probably 100 button presses that an expert cardiac MRI technician presses and adjusts and asks you to hold your breath and do things like that. We've reduced it to one button. It's self-driving for cardiac MRI. So plugging into the edges of your field, like cardiac, is a really good idea. If you sort of want to be a cardiac surgeon, there's so much happening in cardiac surgery, right? So you just heard this phenomenal news. Most people didn't catch the significance of it. Neuralink implanted brain electrodes in a monkey and taught him how to play Pong, the game, by just thinking about it. And the monkey got good enough when the game sped up to where humans couldn't keep up, the monkey did very well playing Pong. Right? Now, we have a startup that does the same thing without needing to open up your skull. So as people went to stents, you did a lot of surgery through stents, like heart valve replacement. Well, we said you can get into the brain through the blood vessels with a small 3 millimeter incision and then implant electrodes locally. They've already been in a few humans. So there's lots of ways you can be at the edges of your field, still use what you're learning and learn new things. But I keep focusing on the most important thing anybody at any age can do, but especially for young people, is increase the rate of learning, which means increase the kinds of things you're exposed to, the environments you're in.
That's really great advice. Dinesh, go ahead for your question.
Hello, thank you so much. Complete pleasure to speak with you, Vinod. I just had a question related to VC. You mentioned in one of your talks about how like 80% of VCs don't provide any value. So why would anybody come to a VC if most of them are not helping entrepreneurs?
Well, there's the other 20%, right?
Right. And
80% of startups also fail. So why do a startup? Because there's a probability of success if you're smart about it.
That's right. But why would anybody go towards venture funding as opposed to, a revenue-based business model? So can you differentiate between those two?
Well, it depends on your preference and your risk profile you want, right? There's no question. It's much easier to build a very large company with the right VC help, but you have the danger of getting the wrong VC help. So it's a tricky question. But it's the same reason. You'll avoid a lot of mistakes. I like to say my biggest advantage is I've screwed up in more ways than anybody else in the whole VC business. I've sort of done so many startups. I've found more ways to fail than anybody, and hopefully, I can avoid repeating those mistakes. So even that is hard because the environment keeps changing. So the assumptions have to keep changing. But that's why you can increase the probability of success with the right VC help. But also depends. If your goal isn't to build a big company, but to build the most fun company, you may be better served by not going to VCs. If you want a much lower risk profile, you might be better served by not going to a VC. When I say we're good at helping build large companies, those are inherently more risky than trying to build $1 million or $2 million in revenue. So you can take a couple of $100,000 home and have a great lifestyle.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's especially great advice for many of our early stage startups who are in the audience. Richard, I'd love to go to your question now.
No, thank you very much for the talk. It's been a pleasure. So I'm a PhD at MIT who's about to throw his hat in the ring for the Silicon Valley VC. And I really, really enjoy you putting this grand vision for how the world is coming to be. On the other hand, we as VCs also have return expectation. We have to return the fund. We have to report to our LPs. And many young VCs like myself, we want to do the world good. We want to change the world. But if it's between Clubhouse and plasma fusion technology, and for a small fund that I'm going to be working for, no brainer, we're going to go for Clubhouse. So any advice on balancing between social good and for the fund?
First, I would say there are large opportunities in social good, also much larger. They're not as fast. So if you only care about short-term success, you go ahead and join a VC fund that likes to do Clubhouse and not take any fundamental R&D risk. Now, we do that too. Right? We do lots of things that are short-term oriented. We will never do an investment that is knowingly negative on society. We will not do that. No matter, there's not a chance in the world we'd ever fund Joel, for example. But we'll also do the long-term, and we mix both so you can have a balance of long-term and short-term. What area is your PhD in?
Mathematics.
Well, it'd be a waste of time to waste it on Clubhouse.
I agree. In general, yeah.
But, there's plenty of opportunities where that works in more impactful things if you don't want to take the very long-term risk. But frankly, at this stage in your VC career, you should be joining firms where you can learn the most and learn the most breadth. The same advice I gave to undergrads applies to PhDs. The next 5-10 years, you want to be in learning and broadening more, right? And then sort of take a balance of short-term and long-term bets. So I don't know which firm you're joining, but it may or may not be appropriate for that. So be careful.
Thank you.
Great question, Richard. Adam, go ahead with yours.
Thanks a lot. This is great. I think I had more of a business related question at first, but it's changed a bit based on the discussion. So like on your comment about reinventing societal infrastructure to stop accelerating the past, innovation means throwing the script away. Yet, like in our best efforts to be innovative, we just create more structures. Like the structures are designed to like foster innovation, but because they're structures, they then just constrain innovation anyway. So maybe it's a business and a personal like philosophical question, I suppose, but like how do we create structures that are like designed to allow you to break those structures down to create more structures that foster innovation?
So the first thing is there's no such thing as we. Who do you mean by we? Do you mean I or?
I meant collectively, like in our best efforts.
This is a common problem. The world is a collection of individuals, each with their own opinions, and frankly, each with their own interests and self-interest. So, the right way to do this is to set up the right role models. So more people want to follow that direction versus follow Bernie Madoff. They're all ways to make money, or have a satisfying life, and I want to emphasize, doing important things is way more satisfying than making more money, in my view, but other people may have a different programming in their head. I would also say there are plenty of things that are just better business models, not necessarily huge innovations. Livongo is a good example of a company. There was nothing innovative on technology, but they did a good job of serving a need to manage diabetic patients. And they did pretty well at it. So it was no great breakthrough. It was thinking about the model differently. We have a company called Affirm. That was a math play mostly. Say, can we discard FICO scoring, which everybody uses, come up with our own instant scoring system so we can offer instant and fine-grained credit on the web? And that's gone from one person with that idea, with a very mathematical orientation. Max Levchin is that kind of person. He built the whole company on credit. But it's a very good example. In fact, one of the things Max also did, we talked about it a lot, was for most financial institutions anybody here is going to work for, they're pretty sleazy. Their principal business model is the fine print. So Verizon will, or Bank of America may make more money of late fees and bounce checks than out of their principal business. I don't know the exact numbers, so don't take me. But my point is, a lot of there's tens of billions of dollars of late fees in this country. That's an opportunity for somebody, and Max decided he would not have fine print and no late fees. If somebody was getting behind, we'd help them catch back up, not hope they stay there and keep paying more fees. So ethics can play a large role in how you build your business. And businesses aren't always, most people don't think of a firm as a math-based business. It's really a risk assessment business. It's actuarial math mostly.
Thanks.
Great. Just being mindful of time, I think we'd love to start to wrap up now. Vinod, if you could kind of leave our audience with some parting thoughts and advice that you'd like to give them on either their entrepreneurial or VC journeys, that would be great.
Well, I've really said the key things. First, the environment you put yourself in, like the last question, where you can learn the fastest and see more change, is the most important thing you can do. The teams you build and the teams you join is the most important thing. And then be very, very critical about how you think of opportunities. When I critique pundits, they're mostly extrapolating the past, not inventing the future. What people fresh in a field, and it applies to both younger people fresh in a field as well as older people operating outside their field, is they have to learn to think from first principles. Don't take conventional wisdom, which is really, experience is just a set of biases. That's all it is. Now, when you're doing extrapolating the past, those biases prevent mistakes. When you're inventing the future, those biases become a handicap. Hence, very few people with expertise in the area ever really innovate an area. So learn to think from first principles, learn to challenge conventional wisdom, learn to be comfortable with ambiguity, and learn to be comfortable with failure. There was the Harvard Business School case that has a quote for me that says, "My willingness to fail is what gives me the ability to succeed." So that's 4 or 5 things that would be, I feel very comfortable telling your audience to take seriously.
Thank you so much, Vinod. I personally really enjoyed that, and I'm sure a lot of people will be able to take away some really valuable pieces of advice and insights into the future of innovation in our world. We truly appreciate your time, and thank you everyone for coming. I'll pass it on to Priyanka for some last announcements.
Yes,
Thank you all very much. Bye-bye.
I just want to echo what Natasha said. A huge thank you. For those of you who have to go, feel free to log off. But just some last announcements is that our next Fireside Chat will be taking place on Monday with Seth Berkowitz, who is the founder and CEO of Insomnia Cookies and runs the Beacon VC. And so if you're interested in joining that, please feel free to check out our website or our RSVP at the link I just provided. If you want to see a recording of this great Fireside Chat, feel free to check out our website, harvardcap.org, and it'll also be posted on our YouTube page, and I will be sending out this link to everyone who registered through the Zoom link. Thanks again for joining. If you have any questions at all about staying in touch with HUCP or MIT Capital Partners, like I said, feel free to email us or check out our website. And thanks again for joining this great event. Bye-bye, everyone.